Well, today we're going to continue in our series through the book of Mark. And it is, I will say, during the Christmas season, a lot of times what we do in our sermon series is we'll have a special Christmas series. We're not really doing that this year. We're going to stick with our timeline as we go through the book of Mark. We'll be in Mark chapter 4 today. But as we go through the book of Mark, there are definitely still some connections that we're going to make with the season as well, even though we're not going to be reading quote-unquote Christmas texts over the next few weeks, although there will be some intersections in what's going on right now with this season. But I wanted to start off today by asking you to consider in your life right now, what kind of what storms are you going through? And I was thinking a lot about that this week as I was preparing, and I was thinking of the different storms that have happened in my life. And of course, every storm comes with its different severity. Some storms that we have in our lives are some that they kind of come and go really quick. Some of them we may not even remember a week or a year from now. But then there are some storms in our life that come, that get our attention, and they really do change who we are. They change the way that we look at life, it changes the way that we look at people, and it might even change the way we look at ourselves. I can think of many storms, and as I was thinking through some of the storms, one of the biggest storms that I can ever remember going through in my life was about, it'll soon be here in just a few weeks. It's probably already by now because of the way the dates are, but one of the biggest storms was about 21 years ago, and that was when my daughter Hannah, we thought that we were going to lose her. When my wife was only about 5 months pregnant, started having contractions, and they had to move Hannah to a different hospital, and it was not good. And here it is, all these years later, and I still think about that moment, and like, what would life have been like without Hannah? It would have been, I can't imagine it now. And it was a storm that really shook me, and it reminded me of the fragility of life, how fragile life is. And then I got to be thinking of other storms in my life, people who I've loved who've passed away, and maybe decisions that I made that weren't the best ones, that brought consequences and turbulence into my life. Some of it has been even within church work, where there's been times where it's been challenging. I mean, we all know how that went during COVID, right? We all went through some COVID storms here in the last few years. All of us have storms, and during this season of Christmas, Christmas really has the opportunity to kind of bring those storms back to mind, or to make those storms maybe a little bit more turbulent. And here's what I mean. Maybe for some of you here today, at Christmas, what do? We tend to be around family a little bit more. And maybe this Christmas you're not around family because there's storms. And so you're reminded of that much more easily and readily during this season. Maybe somebody is not going to be visiting you this year because they've passed away. And there's the storm that happened. It may have been a few weeks ago. It may have been years ago. But Christmas has a way of kind of bringing back a reminder of these storms that have happened in our lives and how they affect us today. And when we go into the passage we're going to look at today, we're going to be in, like I mentioned, we're going to be in Mark. I want us to think a little bit about what happens when we come to these storms. And the question really is this: what are we supposed to do when life just seems too much? What are we supposed to do when it seems like we're being overwhelmed? Christmas, it's really easy to get overwhelmed, isn't it? Really easy. We've got things to do, people to see. But I want to challenge you today to just take a moment to try to step out of the season for the moment as we're just getting the season started. And I want us to think a little bit about what we're supposed to do when things just seem too much. What can Jesus do when these moments seem too much? And Jesus teaches us what we should do. In Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41, I think we are going to experience this morning one of the most awe-inspiring yet scary moments of Jesus' ministry. It was one of these moments that as we look back, and we've probably read this story dozens of times, it really doesn't surprise us when we read the story, but I want to really encourage you to put yourself in the place of the disciples who, up until this passage we're going to read here in just a second, they had been going through, I guess, what you would consider to be a normal day, albeit there was really no normal days with Jesus, but it was a day where they had seen Jesus teach and preach, they had seen people be healed, they had seen some extraordinary things, and yet what they were about to experience for themselves was nothing like they had ever experienced before. If you read there in verse 35, here's what it says. As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." And so they took Jesus in the boat, and they started out, and they left the crowds behind, although some other boats did follow. Now, the temptation when you read this story is to just move on to the rest, because the rest of the story is a little bit more exciting than these two verses. But you know what? These two verses, I think, are pivotal in really understanding what happened later in the passage. You know, it's easy to overlook these passages because we want to see the extraordinary thing that happens. But the Bible, one of the things that I think we overlook with the Scriptures is that the Bible has a way of showing us how it fits into our ordinary days. And that's what I want to share with you here is this. The ordinary days always have the potential for the unexpected. See, that's what's going on here with the disciples. They're going out onto the lake. They've been out on this lake dozens of times, hundreds of times even. Many of them lived on the lake practically. That's where they made their livelihood. And so they go out on the Sea of Galilee, and they think, okay, we're going to cross over. We're going to just experience just another day on the evening on the lake. And so they begin to go across. But yet they didn't know what was to come. And you know what? Each and every day, all of us, we kind of go across our own lakes, our own seas. Maybe it's a drive to work. Maybe it's going to class. Maybe it's getting up even in the morning and having a cup of coffee. We all have these ordinary days, but then what happens to us every now and then is something extraordinary happens that can change our life. You get a phone call from someone about someone who's sick, or maybe someone who's passed away. You get something in the mail. You get an email or a text. And it changes the whole day, doesn't it? And see, what I want us to consider is that God reaches into our ordinary days. And yes, He interrupts our lives sometimes with these extraordinary things because He wants to teach us something. See, the disciples had gone through a day where they had seen Jesus teach and preach. But now it was time for them to practice what they had learned. Now it was going to be time for them to actually live out what they had heard. Because it's really easy. I know we were talking in our group this morning. It's really easy to come on a Sunday morning, and it's a safe place. We read the Word together. We talk, converse. We have relationships with other Christ followers. We catch up. I mean, probably today we talk Thanksgiving, talking about what's coming up for Christmas, these kinds of things. It's easy in these kind of places to be connected and deep in our relationship with God. But it's when the storms come, it's when the challenges come, that it can get really hard to follow Jesus. And that's where the disciples are soon to find themselves. It had been kind of an easier environment during the day, but now things were going to change and things were going to be different. And that's why it's so important for us. We have to always be on guard. We have to always be ready. We have to know that at some point something in our ordinary day could change. I like what 1 Corinthians says. Be on guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong, and do everything with love. What Paul's writing to the Corinthian church is he's saying, be ready for when the storms come, and when they do come, go through them with love. And see, that's what Jesus is soon about to do as we keep reading here. Look in verse 37. It says, while they were out there on the lake, out on the sea, soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and what did it do? It began to fill with water. I'm sure they're starting to get worried. And then it goes on to say, Jesus, though, while they're all worried and Jesus is sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. And the disciples woke him up and they shouted, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" Now, remember that these men who are in the boat, they've been in a boat like this hundreds of times. They've gone through storms before. They knew that this was no ordinary storm. They knew that this storm had the potential to take their lives, and so they were filled with fear. Now, we're not 100% sure, but if we look deeper into the text, there is something that I do want to point out. It does seem like the boat that they were in this story was perhaps different than some of the other types of boats that they would normally be in. This was more of a commercial fishing boat, a little bit bigger. And yet, as big as this boat was on this lake, on the Sea of Galilee, they were scared because they knew that their lives were on the line, that this storm had the potential of being too much. Now, none of us in here, I'm guessing, have been on a boat in the middle of a horrible storm and the water's coming in over the sides and we're afraid that it's going to sink. But you know what? There are moments in our lives, there are things that happen in our lives that feel a lot like this. We're riding in the boat, we're going through our typical ordinary day, and then things happen and the water starts coming over and we're scared to death and we don't know what to do. That's where the disciples are at here. And we see these two radically different reactions to this storm, right? We have the disciples who are just filled with fear, and then we have Jesus who is, he's filled with peace. He's not worried. They were all in the same boat, and yet they reacted so differently. Now, was the reaction of the disciples a bad reaction? Of course, no, it wasn't. I mean, God, I hate to say it like this, but God didn't create us to be stupid, right? I mean, if we're about to sink in a boat, yeah, we need to react to that. We don't want to just sit there and just sink with the boat. So the reaction isn't necessarily a wrong one, but they had forgotten something. And we forget this too. They'd forgotten who was on the boat with them. They were so overwhelmed by the situation. They were so overwhelmed by the storm that they had forgotten who was sitting right there in the boat with them. See, here's the thing. When storms come, I want you to know today that Jesus doesn't run. Now, we might think that sometimes. We might wonder, okay, where are you at? I want you to know today that when storms come, Jesus doesn't run. We often know our storms. The storms that come into our life, we often know them quite well because they often come back again and again. But what we don't really remember very well is the nature of the one who is riding in the boat with us. Now, here's something that maybe you've never thought of before. If you go over a few chapters, we're going to talk about this here in a few weeks. In Mark chapter 6, we read of another situation where they're out on the lake, and what does Jesus do? He walks on water. Now, let's think about this for a minute. So we know that Jesus has the ability to walk on water. Here's this storm. They were being inundated by the waves. What could he have done? He could have walked away. Now, I know that's not his nature, but that option was there, right? I mean, he can walk on water. He could have just walked away from this situation, but that's not the way Jesus works. He stayed in the boat with them. I want you to know that whatever you're going through today, he's not going to walk out on you either. He's not going to leave the boat. He's going to ride out the storm with you. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, it says, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." You know what? That's what happened on the boat, wasn't it? You have the disciples, they're freaking out. They're scared. And what do? They cast all their anxiety toward Jesus, although I'm not sure that they are casting it in the way that maybe in the type of way that they should have. But nonetheless, they cast their anxiety on Jesus. I want you to know today that when your finances are tight, Jesus is not going to walk out on you in that moment. When you mess up and you make a really bad decision, Jesus isn't going to say, well, forget you, I'm going somewhere else. That's not the way Jesus works. He's not going to walk out on you. And not only will he not walk out on you, but he'll go a step further. He's going to do something if we invite him to. Because if you keep reading, look what happens next. When Jesus woke up, so again, they wake Jesus up, he rebukes the wind, and he says to the waves, "Silence, be still." And suddenly the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. And then he asked them, he asked them these two questions. Why are you afraid, and do you still have no faith? This is so important. This point here I want to bring up here is so important. See, a storm's power is only as much as we allow it. If Jesus is in the boat with us, that storm only has as much power in our lives as we allow it to. Why? Because Jesus has authority over that storm. Now, do you believe that? Do you live like that? Do you truly believe that he has authority over the storm that's happening in your life? Because I think sometimes we have it up here, but not so much here. Like we know that he has authority, but we don't feel it. We don't give him that authority. You know, evidently, when we look at this story, the disciples, they didn't know Jesus all that well. I mean, they knew at least, I guess, enough to go to Jesus and say, hey, we're about to drown here. But, you know, if they really had a type of faith that really believed in the authority of Jesus, they would have gone back to Jesus and said, hey, Jesus, you know what? Things are a little dicey right now, but we're not too worried because we know that you're in control. And we know the abilities you have. We know that you could stop this storm. But that's not what they do, is it? They go there out of fear. And they don't realize what Jesus can do. And I'm not trying to say today that it's bad for us to not, to go to Jesus. No, we go to Jesus. But we have to realize that instead of seeing a storm as something that we overcome, because that's often what we hear, right? This word overcome. We have to understand that a storm really has no power to begin with if Jesus is at the helm. We're only giving that storm the authority because we have forgotten that Jesus is at the helm. When Jesus awakens, when he wakes up during the storm, we see here that he rebukes the wind and the waves. There's a word here that's a very powerful and it's very emphatic. It's epitomao, which is to reprove or censure. So you know what he's doing? I saw one commentator say that when he was speaking to the storm, he was speaking to the storm like it was a young toddler throwing a temper tantrum. He's saying, silence, be still. You know, he's like, hey, don't forget that I'm still in charge here. You know what? We need those words in our lives too. Because let's just be honest. Yeah, we're older, maybe we're middle-aged, senior adults, maybe we're in high school. But when it comes to God, all of us in here are toddlers. Okay? I know you might not like to hear that, but it's true. And Jesus is speaking to you and me today, and he's saying, you know what? You know those storms? I'm going to speak to them. If you invite me to, if you let me in, I'm going to come in and say, silence, be still. And Jesus asked these two questions. And I think we can learn something from these two questions. And these are questions for us today. In verse 40, he asks them first, why are you afraid? That's a really good question to ask yourself today. With whatever storm it is that you're going through in your life right now, why are you afraid? Sometimes it's insecurity. Sometimes it's fear. It's the unknown. Ask yourself that question. I would have loved to have been, because I'm sure there was more conversation about that's not recorded in the scripture. I would have loved to have been there and heard some of the answers of the disciples to this. When he asked them, why are you afraid? Because I'm sure that they had probably a lot of the same reasons that we have for being afraid. And then he asks this other question, do you still have no faith? So he's saying, you just saw what happened. Do you still have no faith? You know what? Each and every one of us in here today, I know you're going through some kind of a storm. That's a given. But we have all gone through storms in the past too, haven't we? And here we are. And what Jesus is asking you is, do you still have no faith? I've brought you through the storms before. I just brought you through this one. I'm going to bring you through the one you're going through right now. Do you still have no faith? Chuck Swindoll, he's a commentator. I like what he said. He said when Jesus told the disciples, when they left and after he'd done his teaching and his preaching and his healing, he said, let us go over to the other side. He didn't say, hey, let's go to the bottom. I like that. In other words, what he's saying is he's saying, hey, I'm going to get you to the other side. I didn't promise you there wouldn't be a storm along the way. I didn't promise you that things were going to really stink sometimes. I didn't promise you that you were always going to get along with everybody at work. I didn't promise you that your finances were always going to be perfect. I didn't promise you that your health was always going to be just great. But I've told you, and I'm going to keep this promise to you, I am going to take you to the other side. I didn't bring you out on this lake just to sink you. And I want you to know that today. Whatever it is that you're walking through today, He didn't bring you out on the lake to take you to the bottom. He is going to bring you through. See, they had forgotten that they had God in their boat. You know what? You have God in your boat. You have God in your boat. And look at verse 41. Look at their reaction to this. It says, the disciples were absolutely terrified, and they asked this question. They said, who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him. You know what? If you compare the fear that the disciples had in the storm with the fear they now had of realizing who Jesus is, they had a much greater fear now than they did even during the storm, because they realized, who is sitting in our boat? Who is this guy? Wait a minute. This isn't just any ordinary guy. This is God Himself. And so here's something I want to also share with you today, is that fear that is directed in the right way will get us through the day. You know what? Maybe it's not so much about not having fear. It's about having fear directed in the right direction, directed toward the right place, or more specifically to the right person. Because that's what happens here, right? The disciples, they're scared. They're like, oh my goodness. They ask this question, and by the way, this question right here is maybe the most important one that can ever be asked. Who is this man? Because how we answer that question changes a lot about the way that we live today, changes everything about our eternity. How you answer that. Who is this man? And they were in fear, and not a fear that's necessarily a bad fear. It's a fear of understanding who Jesus really is. If we want to find peace in the storms of our lives, how we answer this question that they asked, who is this man? How we answer it is going to change the way we go through our storms. If you only see Jesus as a friend, I mean that's not bad, but friends don't have the power to take away storms. If you see Jesus as a good counselor, okay, yeah, he's wise, no doubt about it. But counselors, they might be able to help talk you through it a little bit, but they can't take away the storm. They can't help you find peace in the storm. No, how you answer this question by accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and that He is God. That is how you overcome the storm. And so today, what I want us to think about, the main point is this, is that we have to learn to accept His presence over your circumstance. You have to learn to accept His presence over your circumstance. See, the only way that you are going to overcome things, the only way that you're going to get through to the other side is when you take away the power from the circumstance that you're going through, and instead you recognize the person and the presence of Jesus. You know what, in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, there's a very well-known prophecy that's there about Jesus, because we have to ask this question, well, who is Jesus? And Isaiah says this, "For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Now, we hear that a lot at Christmas time, don't we? It's a prophecy of who Jesus is. But you know what? It's more than just that. It tells us who He is. It tells us that Jesus is our wonderful counselor. You know, when your circumstances are too much, He's there to listen. But do you ask Him? Do you pray? Do you talk with Him? It says, Mighty God. Do you stop in the circumstance and consider and are convinced of the power that He has? Everlasting Father. You know what? He was there way before the storm you're going through ever came along, and He's going to be here way after our storms are gone, way after we leave this world. He's the Prince of Peace. How is He the Prince of Peace? Because He has dominion over this world. He can bring peace. Now, I said to you a few minutes ago, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Danny, you said that, counselor, and, is that really... You kind of alluded, Danny, that a counselor is not going to get you through. Look, notice here that there's more to Jesus than just being a counselor. He is a counselor, but there's more to it. But here's where we miss out. I think sometimes out of these attributes that we read here in Isaiah 9, what we tend to do is we may accept one of them, but not two of them. Or like some of us might accept the counselor part, but not so much about the mighty God part. Or the everlasting Father. Yeah, we'll take that, but no, the man that came into this world, Jesus, is God. He is our everlasting Father, our wonderful Counselor, mighty God, and Prince of Peace. Every bit of those things is every bit of Him. That is how we get through storms, is by accepting these attributes of who He is. But here's what's happened, though, is too many times we've allowed our circumstances to take the place that only Jesus deserves to be in. We've allowed Jesus to be replaced by the circumstance. The reason we feel powerless is because we have given to the problem or the person or the circumstance the power that only belongs to Jesus. Think about it right now. You have probably allowed this issue, this storm in your life, to just overwhelm your thinking. It's always on your mind, it's always on your heart, and sometimes it just feels like too much. Remember the question we started with? What are we supposed to do when it just feels like it's too much? Well, for many of us, the answer is to just keep thinking about it and letting it be too much. And not handing it over to Jesus. Not understanding who Jesus is. We have said that the problem is our counselor. Going back again to Isaiah 9. Wonderful counselor. Well, what we've done is instead of seeing Jesus as the counselor, we've allowed that situation to counsel us. So what does the situation tell us? It tells us lies. It tells us untruths. It even creates realities that just simply aren't true. We've allowed that problem to become our counselor. Have you ever thought of it like that before? Let's think some more. We say, or Isaiah says there that He is mighty God. You know what? For some of us here today, our problems have become pretty mighty, haven't they? We've replaced Jesus with the problem. We think it has the power. We've given it the power. Everlasting. We think that the problem that we're going through is never going to go away. That it can't go away. That it can't be overcome. We've given it that kind of power. And even the attribute that we read there in Isaiah 6 of Jesus being the Prince of Peace, what do? We've allowed that problem, that storm, to be given dominion over our life. And it's become our master. Have you ever thought that you've made gods, and I say that plurally, you've made gods out of your storms? You know, we in church a lot of times we talk about gods like, it can be an activity or it can be anything that you give allegiance to higher than God. But you know what? We can do that with our storms, can't we? We can be so focused and dwell so much on our storms that they become our gods. And you know what? Christmas time, I don't know about you, but that seems to maybe happen a little bit more. Because some things, again, like I mentioned when we started, things just they get magnified a little bit, don't they? So what are some storms in your life that you have turned into gods? That you have given a higher place than Jesus? I mean, the challenge I want to ask you is, what is something that has taken over your headspace? And I want to challenge you today to give that space to Jesus instead. How have you allowed problems in your family? Maybe it's in a marriage. Maybe it's in a relationship with somebody else in your family. Have you allowed that fear to become a god rather than giving that over to Jesus and saying, Jesus, I know you can overcome this? Or have we just held on to the storm and accepted it? How about even in our workplaces, even in our school, we have problems, and what do? We allow the problems to become so big, and we never invite God. We are never reminded that God is right there with us in the boat. See, if we come to the realization that Jesus is right there in the boat, we're going to find more joy, and we're actually going to live. You know what? There's so many of us, and I've been there. We're not living life because we're too busy worshiping the storms. Jesus said that He came to give us life and to give it in the fullest. You're not going to live it in the fullest when you don't invite Jesus to have authority over the storms. It's not going to happen. We have to give Him that authority, and that's what I want to challenge you to think about today. And it all starts by giving our lives to Jesus. It all starts by having a relationship with Jesus, by experiencing the grace and the joy and the forgiveness that Jesus brings. But it goes beyond that initial moment of our relationship with Jesus. It also goes into this idea that we've seen today, that we have to accept and recognize that Jesus is right there in the boat with us. And when we go out on the lake, when we head out every day, on that ordinary day, when we think we have an ordinary schedule, we go out knowing that something could happen. And if it does, we are unafraid because we know who's in the boat with us. See, it's about knowing who the captain is of the boat, but it's also knowing that we can always call upon the captain of the boat whenever we run into the storms that happen in our lives. See, joy, and I think that's what we're all seeking in our lives. We want to know what joy is. Joy doesn't come from overcoming circumstances. You know, we think, if I just overcame this problem in my life, I would be joyful. I'm telling you, it might bring you a temporary respite, but it's not going to last. You know what? Joy comes from sharing the circumstance with Jesus and knowing that He's in the boat there with us. You know what? You might not have ever known this. Did you know that what happened with Jesus and His disciples on the boat that day was actually prophesied in the Old Testament? Did you know that? If you look in Psalm, I believe it's Psalm 107, I believe is what it is. I had it written wrong in my notes, but in Psalm 107, here's what it says. It says, others went out on the sea in ships, and they were merchants on the mighty waters, and they saw the works of the Lord, His wonderful deeds in the deep. For He spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In other words, up and down the waves. And in their peril, their courage melted away. And they reeled and they staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end. And then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. And he brought them out of their distress. And what did he do? He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. And then I love this last verse. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for men. Isn't that cool? I've read that before, but it's been years ago, and when I was studying this week, I thought, wow, this gives us an insight even more so into what happened. Those last two verses, they were glad when it grew calm, and what did he do? He guided them to their desired haven. I want to give you hope today that whatever storm you're going through, God's going to get you home. He's going to get you home. He's going to get you there. And in the meantime, be grateful that he's in the boat with you. He's going to take you there.